Thank you. My name is Leona Theron. I have the privilege of working in this wonderful building with 10 fantastic colleagues, and I enjoy coming to work every day, as I'm sure you can understand why. On behalf of the Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, the Deputy Chief Justice, Mandisa Maya, and all the judges of this court, we welcome you today to this very, very auspicious occasion. My first announcement relates to a water shortage that we are currently experiencing. Arrangements for water has been made. There are facilities, bathroom facilities, temporary, movable facilities that are outside. My task this evening is to welcome you, to thank you for coming, each and every one, and our most distinguished guest, Justice Richard Goldstone. You're most welcome. The ambassador, the US ambassador, and Justice Madlango will all receive a further and a fuller welcome from the Dean. And my task is also to introduce the Dean to you. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce his wife, Mrs. Angie Cole, who's looking stunning. Please, will you stand up, Mrs. Angie Cole? And we all know, South Africans in particular, the saying, Umuntu, Ngubuntu, Gabantu. And I can definitely say he is because of her. I had the privilege of meeting Dean Cole almost 2 years ago. And I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in God incidents. And it so happens that my daughter is doing a PhD at Notre Dame University. And the law school got to know that a judge from the Constitutional Court in South Africa was there. And they said, no, the law school has to take some sort of ownership. And I spent a great deal of time, twice already, at the law school and made many, many friends there, including with Dean Marcus Cole. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction of Dean Cole because he said I shouldn't say too much. Perhaps I'm going to start off by talking more about the man, Marcus Cole, than the Dean. You will not get a more genuine person than Dean Marcus. His heart is in the right place. And what he has tried to do and what he's currently doing is extending the links and the ties of the university with Africa. Prior to now, there was a concentration between American universities and universities in Europe. And Dean Cole saw a gap and he said, but what about our brothers and sisters in Africa? And we applaud that, we applaud him for that, and we applaud the university for supporting his initiatives. And somebody once said on their tombstone, all that they want to be written is, here lies a great man. And I'm going to say, next to me sits a great man. So his official title, he is the Joseph A. Matson Dean and Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School. He was appointed by the university president, Reverend John Jenkins, and began his term on July 1st, 2019. He is currently in his second term. He is the 11th dean in the history of Notre Dame. And this is not here in the CV, but in the history of the law school and the university, I think it's 200 years, he's the first black dean of the university. He is a leading scholar of the empirical law and economics of commerce and finance. He was a faculty member at Stanford Law School before he came to Notre Dame, and he spent more than 20 years in Notre Dame, in Stanford. He has an illustrious career. I'm not going to read it all to you, but I'll tell you this. He has made his mark in the US, and he's going to make his mark in South Africa. Dean Jean Marc Caro, I welcome you.
Thank you, Justice Theron, for that very generous welcome and introduction. I'm very grateful. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you all for being here with us. As Justice Theron said, I'm Dean Marcus Cole. I'm the Dean of the Law School at the University of Notre Dame, which is the oldest Catholic law school in the United States. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to this panel discussion honoring Justice Richard Goldstone for his role in the establishment of the Human Rights Program at Notre Dame Law School. 50 years ago, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon asked for the resignation of Notre Dame President Father Theodore Hesburgh as chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights because, according to President Nixon in his own words, Father Hesburgh was, quote, moving too fast on civil rights. So after stepping down, Father Hesburgh decided to continue his fight for racial justice by establishing the Center for Civil Rights at Notre Dame Law School. And he quickly realized that the people of South Africa were engaged in the same fight for racial justice and equality. So Father Hesburgh turned to his friend, a friend since, I believe, 1959, is that correct? Turned to his friend, then Judge Richard Goldstone, for guidance. And when Father Hesburgh asked Justice Goldstone what the University of Notre Dame could do to help in the fight against apartheid, Justice Goldstone replied, "Train our lawyers." That idea from the man who we honor tonight was the spark that created the Notre Dame Law School program in human rights. That spark of an idea has ignited a flame that has brought the light of hope to people all around the world. Today, under the direction of Professor Diane Desierto, who is here with us tonight, the Notre Dame Law School program in human rights boasts alumni in over 100 countries around the world. Many of these human rights defenders are leaders in the fight against oppression. Some are political prisoners. All owe their training and courage, all owe their training to the courage and wisdom of one man, Justice Richard Goldstone of South Africa. Justice Richard Goldstone served as a Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa from 1994 to 2003. And from 1994 to 1996, he served as the Chief Prosecutor of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. He has taught as a distinguished professor of international law at the law faculties of Harvard Law School, New York University Law School, Stanford Law School, Georgetown University Law Center, the University of Virginia Law School, and Fordham Law School. And he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Justice Goldstone co-chairs and serves as the honorary president of the Human Rights Institute of the International Bar Association, and has also served as a member of the Distinguished International Group of Advisors of the International Committee of the Red Cross. He was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General to investigate allegations regarding the Iraq Oil for Food program and chaired a UN committee to advise the United Nations on appropriate steps to preserve the legacy of international criminal tribunals. He led the famous fact-finding mission on possible war crimes and international human rights violations committed by any party during military actions in Gaza in December 2008 and January 2009. He continues to serve in innumerable leading investigative human rights initiatives at the request of the United Nations, including chairing the International Independent Inquiry on Kosovo and chairing the high-level group of international experts that drafted the Declaration of Human Duties and Responsibilities, the Valencia Declaration, for UNESCO. He co-chaired the International Task Force on Terrorism established by the International Bar Association, among other crucial duties he assumed in the international system, including as a board member in leading human rights institutes and international non-governmental organizations. Justice Goldstone served from 1995 to 2007 as the Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, and is also an honorary bencher of Inner Temple in London, and an honorary fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge University, and a fellow of Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Among his innumerable accolades, he received the Thomas J. Dodd Prize in International Justice and Human Rights, the World Peace Through Law Award, the Richard Neustadt Award at Harvard, the International Justice Award of the MacArthur Foundation, and the Stockholm Award for International Peace. And among all of these awards, we're grateful and honored to have him here back in this building, which he helped to establish in 1994. Welcome, Justice Goldstone. To Justice Goldstone's right is the United States Ambassador to South Africa, His Excellency Dr. Reuben Bregetti. Dr. Reuben Bregetti is the United States Ambassador to South Africa since 2022, and he served as the 17th Vice Chancellor of the University of the South and Mayor of Sewanee from June 2020 until December 2021. Previously, he served as the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Ambassador Bregetti's most recent diplomatic assignment was serving as the U.S. representative to the African Union and U.S. permanent representative to the UN Economic Commission for Africa from September 2013 to September 2015. Previously, Ambassador Bregetti served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs, and also as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Ambassador Bregetti was a former researcher with Human Rights Watch, the Arms Division, where he conducted research missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Before this, he was an active duty U.S. naval officer holding several staff positions in the Pentagon and in fleet support units. Ambassador Bregetti is a 1995 Distinguished Midshipman graduate of the United States Naval Academy, where he earned a Bachelor of Science in Political Science with merit and served as the brigade commander and received the Thomas G. Pownall Scholarship. He also holds a Master MPhil and a PhD in International Relations from the University of Cambridge in England, as well as a Doctor of Humane Letters honoris causa from Old Dominion University in Virginia. Ambassador Bregetti is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and recipient of the Council's International Affairs Fellowship. He is a member of the Board of Counselors of McClarty Associates, an adjunct senior fellow for African Peace and Security at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a fellow of the American Academy of Diplomacy. Please join me in welcoming the U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Reuben Bregetti. And to the ambassador's right is Justice Buyiseli Russell Madlanga. Justice Madlanga is a justice of this Constitutional Court of South Africa, appointed in August 2013. He holds his Bachelor of Jurisprudence degree from the University of the Transkei, his Bachelor of Laws from Rhodes University, and his LL.M. cum laude from the greatest law school in the world, Notre Dame Law School. He also holds a Doctor of Laws honoris causa from Walter Sisulu University. He is a renowned judge with a distinguished career serving in previous judicial positions as judge of the Eastern Cape Division of the High Court, acting judge of the Supreme Court of Appeal, acting judge president of the Transkei Division of the High Court, judge of the Competition Appeal Court, acting justice of the Constitutional Court. He has also taught at the University of Transkei, practiced as a senior counsel in the Eastern Cape, and served as deputy chair of the Competition Tribunal, as well as chairperson of the Exchange Control and Income Tax Amnesty Unit, member of the Judicial Service Commission, chair of the Mahata Society of Advocates, and led the Marikana Commission of Inquiry. He is in the advisory boards of the South African Law Journal and the Yearbook of South African Law and de jure. And joining us by video at the very end of the panel is Justice Albie Sachs. Justice Albie Sachs is a former justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, renowned as a distinguished lawyer, judge, and anti-apartheid activist and scholar. He was part of the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign at the University of Cape Town, and upon graduation and passing the Cape Bar, his practice involved defending people charged under racist statutes and repressive security laws. His involvement in this line of work landed him in trouble with the police on several occasions as he was subjected to imprisonment, solitary confinement, detention, and banning orders. There are not enough words to do justice to the long arc of his activist work. His famous books, Justice in South Africa, Sexism and the Law, Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, The Strange Alchemy of Life and the Law. On the 7th of April, 1988, when Albie Sachs unlocked his parked car in Maputo, a bomb planted by the South African Security Services exploded. The explosion killed a passerby and left Justice Sachs gravely wounded. Riddled with shrapnel, his ribs broken, his eardrum punctured, Albie Sachs was rushed to the hospital. Doctors labored for 7 hours to save his life. He survived, but he had lost his right arm and the sight in one eye. In the 1980s, Albie Sachs helped to draft the ANC's Code of Conduct along with its statutes with Oliver Tambo, the leader of the organization. He also worked to prepare a new democratic constitution for South Africa. During this time, in the 1990s, Albie Sachs became a member of the National Executive of the ANC and a member of the Constitutional Committee of South Africa. He took part in the negotiations that made South Africa a constitutional democracy, and he was appointed by President Nelson Mandela to serve in the Constitutional Court. Through his time as judge, he earned a global reputation for being a conscience of the court. And it feels awkward for me to ask you to welcome Justice Madlanga and Justice Albie Sachs to their very own court, but please let's do just that. So I want to start my questioning wow, it's really raining hard here. So it's a good thing that we're inside. I want to start by asking a question of justice. So I'd like you, if you could, tell us the story of your long friendship with Father Theodore Hesburgh, the president, the longtime president of the University of Notre Dame, and how it came to be that when Father Hesburgh asked you what Notre Dame could do, you told him to train our lawyers. Tell us about your friendship and tell us why that was important to you.
Well, Dean Caro, thank you very much indeed, firstly, for your very, very generous welcome and for your wonderful invitation to participate in this program tonight, which really came as a bolt out of the blue a few weeks ago when I received,
the acoustics are
received your very warm email. My connection with Father Theodore Hesburgh goes back many years to 1959. I was then the chairperson of the Student Representative Council of the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And Father Hesburgh decided, he'd then been the president of Notre Dame, I think, for about 5 years. And he decided to come and see with his own eyes what apartheid South Africa was about. And he brought with him the president of the student body then at Notre Dame. And that's how I became involved in his visit, and we We spent many hours together. We traveled around parts of South Africa together, and we struck a friendship. There was then a gap of 25 years during which we corresponded. But in 1984, I was given the International Visitor Program opportunity to visit the United States. So I was able to spend it over 3 months. And my wife accompanied me. We started in Washington, D.C., and our program officer asked me if I had any special places I wanted to visit. And I said, 25 years ago I met Father Theodore Hesburgh, and I'd love to meet him again. And the program officer said, well, he's a very busy man. And I said, well, why don't you ask him if he's available? And the next day, the surprise program officer said, Father Hesburgh would love you to visit him at Notre Dame, and we'll build it into your program. We drove to South Bend, Indiana from Chicago, and Father Hesburgh had a lovely lunch for us at the Morris Inn, as I recall. And the other guest was the then provost of Notre Dame, Tim O'Mara. Tim O'Mara was the first lay provost of Notre Dame, and he was born and brought up in Cape Town and was a graduate of the University of Cape Town in mathematics. And during the lunch, Father Hesburgh said, is there any way Notre Dame can be helpful in South Africa? And it wasn't difficult. I said for Father Hesburgh, as I then called him, it became Father Ted very soon after. I said to him, I think the most important job that American universities can do in South Africa is help educate our people. In 1984, there was still a very sharp imbalance between the education that white South Africans received and that received by black South Africans. And I said, well, and he interrupted me. He said, I very recently donated to the law school library at Notre Dame all of my private papers, in particular from the United States Civil Rights Commission. He was one of the first 6 members, it was then, of the Civil Rights Commission. And he said there's a trove of information there for any, particularly South African, who wants to learn about human rights and international human rights. He said, I'll do a deal with you. If you choose him or her, we will host all expenses paid, travel, accommodation, food and lodging. We will host one South African student a year to do an LL.M in international human rights. Well, it was a wonderful offer, and I came back to South Africa, and I'm very pleased to see Vinod Jaikand in the audience, because I think he was, if not the first, one of the first recipients of that program. About 3 years into the program, I received a telephone call from then Dean David Link. He said, you send such wonderful people to us, we want to make it 2 a year, not 1. And as far as I'm aware, that has continued to this day, that Notre Dame has hosted 2 South African students to do. So that's really how it came about. That friendship with Father Hesburgh continued really until shortly before he passed away not too many years ago.
Well, we must be engaged in something very important here, because as my wife's grandmother used to say, when it rains this hard, that's the devil working. So he's trying to prevent people from hearing what has to be said up here. So hopefully we'll be able to get through this. This is really incredible. Does it rain like this all the time in South Africa? Well, I'm going to try to ask the ambassador a question. Can you hear me at all? Okay. So on Saturday, my delegation from the University of Notre Dame visited the Apartheid Museum here in Johannesburg. And one of the things that we saw in the Apartheid Museum is an exhibit on the role that American universities played in taking down apartheid and helping to support the efforts of freedom fighters here in South Africa. My question for you is, given that apartheid has fallen and South Africa is now 30 years of constitutional democracy,
I can't hear you. Can't hear you.
So my wife's wisdom is that since it's so difficult to hear anything right now, perhaps we ought to postpone the questioning and simply have our reception and thank our guests for being here. But I do want to present our guests with a gift. And so first, I have a gift for Justice Goldstone. It's a book called This Place Called Notre Dame. And my inscription to you is, Dear Justice Goldstone, words cannot adequately express the debt of gratitude owed to you by Notre Dame lawyers around the world and the millions of people they serve. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody. All protocols observed, justices, deans, distinguished guests. It is a profound honor for me to be here with all of you this evening, in particular because I am not a lawyer. On occasion, I have been confused to be a lawyer. Dean Cole, I think it's the bow tie that does it. But it's a great honor for me to be here with all of you. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I've spent probably about half my adult life in higher education. And also, I've also been a practitioner of human rights, both with Human Rights Watch and a professor as well. And the display you talked about in the Apartheid Museum, which is both a painful and necessary museum, talks about the interplay between the United States and South Africa in the fight for racial justice. As the U.S. ambassador here in South Africa, one of the questions or the assumptions I often get is that the United States was not on the right side of the fight against apartheid until very late, which is something personally as an American citizen I feel great chagrin, great shame about. But what I think is often not well understood in South Africa is that the reason we were so late to the fight against apartheid in South Africa is because we were still reckoning with our own version of apartheid in the United States of America. I was born in 1973, which is either forever ago or yesterday, depending on your historical perspective. But being born in 1973 means I belong to America's born free generation. I belong to the very first generation of African Americans that were born fully free and equal under the law to all of our fellow citizens. My parents were not. Even aunts and uncles and cousins that were born as late as 1965, 66, 67 were not, because of laws that were still on the books and Supreme Court decisions that still yet to be decided. But to your point, one of the things that helped to break the back of segregation and to help to make the promise of America more true for all Americans was the fight on American college campuses. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is because, amongst other things, universities are dedicated to finding the truth. Truths that may be uncomfortable, truths that may be difficult, truths that may be inconvenient, but truth nonetheless. And the second reason why college campuses, I think, provide such a rich forum for finding the truth is because they're filled with young people. And young people are impatient with hypocrisy. Young people are idealistic and demand that the lived reality of the world actually comport with their ideals. One of the things that we talk about in the United States in our founding document, in our Constitution, is the preamble of the Constitution. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. And what does it mean to perfect the union? It means to constantly examine the distance between our professed values and our lived experience and work to close the gap between the two. And one of the things I often say to young audiences, certainly here in South Africa, but also in the United States, is that in a democracy, the price of being a free people is that nobody is coming to save us. We must do this ourselves. And the struggle must be reinvented and reinterpreted for every generation, because that gap between ideals and lived experience is not yet closed. And so what universities like Notre Dame, like others, both in the United States and South Africa, can continue to do is to encourage young people to seek the truth, to encourage them in their natural inclination, to make sure the world lives up to the ideals that it is professed to do, create the infrastructure for that, and do exactly what you're doing, which is to build linkages amongst people, across institutions, across continents, to find like-mindedness in the fight for the continual struggle.
Thank you so much for that. Speaking of the struggle, that struggle led to the South African Constitution, and I've heard many people, both inside of South Africa and outside of South Africa, refer to the South African Constitution as the Rolls-Royce of constitutions. And it's a beautiful document to read. Justice Madlanga, can you tell us what you think the rest of the world can learn both from the South African Constitution and South Africa's experience since 1994 under that Constitution?
Thank you, Dean Cole. Let me start by saying that, ironically, there is somewhat of a controversy brewing within the country with regard to whether our Constitution is indeed a Rolls-Royce Constitution. There are some who have begun making memos saying that this well-acclaimed Constitution is not all that good for the common people on the ground. I will choose not to enter that controversy, but I think it is important to mention that there are the beginnings of such a controversy. I am in the fortunate position that as a justice of the Constitutional Court, I have to apply the Constitution as is, whatever people may think about it. Of course, in that application, I apply it in accordance with how I see it. And obviously and naturally, we see it differently at times, which is why we will have what in America you call opinions, different opinions. Coming closer to the question you asked, I would say that Kenya, for example, has taken from our constitution quite significantly. And in fact, the main differences are structural differences in the sense that how do they compose their parliament, just those structures that form the basis of their governance. But with regards to rights and so on, they have mainly adopted the South African Constitution. Do we have any hope that this may be transported or rather exported beyond places like Kenya? I would say our Constitution is lauded mostly for its justiciable socio-economic rights, and I underline justiciable. So they are not just contained there as empty promises to the people. They are rights that can and have been enforced by our courts. So that's the important aspect in our Constitution. But strangely, if not ironically, it is that very same aspect that I think would be the basis for other jurisdictions not to want to hear a thing about our constitution. Why? One of the factors that are considered when applying socio-economic rights is whether measures taken by government towards the achievement of socio-economic rights are reasonable. As an American or lawyer, you will perhaps immediately find this very strange, if not legally jarring, in the sense that once a court is able to question the reasonableness of policies taken by the executive on matters that ordinarily fall under the purview of functions of the executive, I think an American lawyer will find that very strange. That's not just America, many other places in the world as well. So to cut a long story short, yes, people may say, wonderful constitution, Rolls-Royce constitution, but whether or not beyond that, looking at, admiring, studying other jurisdictions will actually consider adopting our constitution, I have very little hope for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Mlaga. Justice Goldstone, you were here from the beginning, appointed by President Mandela to this court, and so you were among the first justices to apply this new constitution. What challenges did the new South African constitution help South Africa overcome, and where might the constitution fall short, and what might need to be changed?
Well, Dean Kerr, that's a difficult question to answer in a very short time. But I think it certainly was a huge challenge for the first 11 justices of the South African Constitutional Court to implement a brand new constitution in a country where there was a history of not only no constitution, but of egregious, unconstitutional, what any democracy would regard as unconstitutional. So it was a huge challenge because the important aspect is that we felt an obligation to explain to the people of our country that this was a new dispensation, this was a new court, this was a new constitution. And I recall very well that when the court began, I had leave of absence because President Mandela sent me off to The Hague to prosecute war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. But I was present. I came back on a couple of occasions. One was for the hearing of the Constitutional Court into the new constitution. But before that, we met. The 11 of us met to decide how the court should function, what should be the nitty-gritty of the court. And we decided that we had to demonstrate to our people that this was a different court. We had to wear different gowns, not the gowns that had been worn by apartheid judges, and we adopted green gowns. I think it's the only court in the world where judges wear green gowns. We decided that we were going to do away with the title of being addressed as my lord and my lady. There weren't many miladies at that time. It sounded a bit ridiculous anyway, and we decided we'd be called the justice, not my lord. And that was an apartheid accretion, and we thought it was inappropriate. We decided that we would do away with an order of seniority on the court. We wanted all to be equal. I think I was the longest serving judge at that time, but there were other judges on our court who weren't able to be appointed because of the color of their skin, and there was no way that I was going prepared to have my seniority recognized in that situation. So we did away with seniority, and we walked into court each term in a different order. the Chief Justice, the President of the Court, the Chief Justice, and his deputy sat in the middle. And each term we sat in a different order. And I'm happy to say that has remained and become a tradition on the court. There is no seniority on this court. I think these were important steps. We also decided that we had to be media friendly. I remember that I was appointed by Justice Chaskelson to head a media committee. And we decided to have a seminar with the judges and senior journalists and editors of the main newspapers. And we met at the court, and the United States played a role, because the person who came to give the keynote opening address at that two-day conference with the media was Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. He came to South Africa to talk to us about that. So it was, obviously, when it came to implementing the Constitution, it had to be done very transparently and openly, and with open debate, and again, media friendly. We decided to issue summaries of the opinions so that the media would have it immediately accessible to them. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question on the substance of the law, but I think these appearances and transparency were important.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Justice Goldstone. Ambassador Brigetti, I want to ask you, the Nobel Prize winner, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, coined the phrase, the Rainbow Nation, to describe South Africa. And in America, we see that the United States, in a very short time, very soon, within the next decade or so, is going to become a majority-minority country where people from minority backgrounds are going to represent the majority of the population. I want to ask you what it is you think that we as Americans can learn from the Rainbow Nation and their experience here, especially given how deeply politically divided the American public is today.
There is so much for our two countries and our two peoples to learn from each other. Let me start from the American perspective, since you raised it there. The fact that by mid-century, the United States of America will be a majority-minority country in terms of ethnicity simultaneously means nothing and everything. Pardon me. It means nothing, or should mean nothing, if one presumes that as all fellow equal citizens, in the best of ideals, one's race should not matter to anything, to employment, to living opportunities, to life expectancy, etc. But it matters immensely because we know, as I say, in closing the gap between ideal and practice, that that is not the case. Objectively, it is not the case. But more significantly, and this is where I think we have to learn from each other, it matters immensely because as Americans, we have to find a language and a comfort level for us to be able to talk about this without demonizing each other. We have to be able to have a full accounting of our history in ways that may be uncomfortable, but that are true, because if any history matters, all of it does. We need to tell it all so that we can build a future that includes us all. One of my observations, not only during my time here as ambassador, but in my many years coming to South Africa in various capacities, is that post-apartheid South Africa is much more comfortable in talking about its history and talking about both the challenges of the apartheid era and the extent to which the apartheid legacy continues to affect their present, much more comfortable than we are in the United States. As you well know, there are debates happening in the United States right now about what history can be taught. In my home state of Florida, there are books that are banned that in some cases talk about the reality of our history. And That, I think, is the most important thing that we have to learn, that we should learn as Americans from our South African partners, is how do we be honest about the history so that we can build a future that includes us all.
Thank you, Ambassador. Justice Malanga, you are not alone in being one of the really prominent Notre Dame alumni. And I want to ask you, what is it that you've gained from your Notre Dame experience, your Notre Dame legal training, and your experience in America, and how does that inform your role here as a justice on the Constitutional Court?
At my first university, that is where I did my junior law degree, the University of Transkei, they did not offer human rights at all. And so was the case where I did my LLB degree. The LLB then was exclusively a postgraduate degree. So when the opportunity came for me to study at Notre Dame on a scholarship that focused on human rights, I was naturally very happy about that. So Notre Dame was the first place to expose me to human rights. That ignited within me a love for not just human rights, but also constitutional law in general. That explains why after Notre Dame, my practice focused mainly on constitutional and administrative law. So that should tell you, Dean Cole, that studying at Notre Dame contributed quite immensely to my development as a lawyer, and a lawyer that in the end focused on constitutional law. That, I believe, led in some ways to me eventually becoming a justice of this court. And I think it had to be that way because people like the late Father Bill Lewis, who headed the center in my time at Notre Dame, he was human rights personified. I mean, you know of his sojourn in Chile for a while. He was respected there as a human rights lawyer, and also the role that he played with regard to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Also, I was in the fortunate position of receiving tutelage from the late Professor Don Commerce, how can I describe him? Maybe even if it's from history, because you probably got to Notre Dame after he had passed on, I do not know. But an excellent academic. In fact, so excellent that this court has cited his writings a number of times, especially the early judgments. I'm sure Justice Goldstone will attest to that. So having rubbed shoulders as a student, of course, with those academic luminaries, that naturally would have had a great impact on me. Thank you.
Okay, I want to pose one last question to all of you, and so I'm going to ask each of you to answer it. As we look around us in the world, there are lots of challenges to human rights. And I want to ask you where you think the greatest challenges to human rights are today, and what is that lawyers can do to help in the fight for human rights?
Well, Dean Cole, really, it's very difficult today to be optimistic about democracy. Democracy is going down in so many countries where democracy really had its birth. In Western Europe, in your own country, one sees attacks on democracy that would have been unthinkable in the very recent past, and one shouldn't generalize. I think each country has its own problems, its own history, its own approach to these problems. But I think one thing we have in common, and that is the importance, the crucial need, the basic need of recognizing the human dignity of every person. I think that really is fundamental to democracy. And it grieves me in South Africa that we have, notwithstanding this wonderful constitution, we have so much inequality. We have so many people who are robbed of their dignity, not through any fault other than the situation, the country into which they were born at a time when there's unemployment that's really going through the roof. And I think all of us have to do what we can to fix that. The last thing one should do is blame the Constitution. The robbing of people's dignity is in spite of the Constitution, not because of the Constitution. If the Constitution is respected, the dignity will come of it. And I think there's a lesson there that all democracies can learn.
Thank you, Justice Goldstone. Ambassador Brigitte?
In my judgment, the greatest challenge to contemporary human rights is political will. The issue is not a lack of definition, with many rights enshrined in various international treaties or national constitutions or through judicial practice. The issue is will to stand up for them. Let me illustrate this with a story from American history. There's a famous labor organizer and early civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph. And just before World War II, A. Philip Randolph, with a delegation of other early civil rights activists, called on President Roosevelt and said, President Roosevelt, the Negro is not, speaking in the colloquialism at the time, the Negro is not being treated well. He's not being treated equally as articulated in the Constitution. We need equal treatment and equal rights, civil rights for the Negro. President Roosevelt said to Mr. Randolph, I completely agree with you. Now go out there and make me do it. Which was President Roosevelt's way of saying, notwithstanding the fact that we may agree in principle, the political reality is such that in order for us to realize these ideals, we need people to demand that of our leaders and continue to demand it until it is done. And so that is the lesson, particularly for young people, especially for young lawyers today. The definitions of what human rights need to be respected and with the content of it are clear, but you need to go out there and make your leaders do it.
Can I follow up with that? I mean, it's one thing for the people to push leaders, but isn't it the role of a leader to take people where they need to go, even if they don't want to go there?
We could have an entire seminar on different aspects of leadership. Those that lead from the front, those that lead from behind, those that are the charging the hill, and those that are the conciliators. And in fact, all of those are necessary. But what is certainly true, in my judgment, certainly in my field of international affairs, I'm a huge believer in the importance of the person, the woman or the man in the room. History is not inevitable. History is a direct result of the choices that individuals make, whether they be individual citizens or great justices or great stateswomen and statesmen. And what that means is that collectively we are writing tomorrow's history today by virtue of the choices that we make. And the question is, are we going to be courageous enough to demand of our leaders the full realization of our common humanity?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Justice Malanga, since you are our host, I want to give you the last word.
Thank you, Dean Cole. In a sense, the ambassador touched on something I also want to say. In the sense that he referred to the will. Perhaps let me take one step back and touch on something that Justice Goldstone said towards the end of his response to you. He touched on dignity, human dignity. The greatest challenge to human rights today, in my view, is the violation of human dignity on a particular and specific front, and that is corruption. Why do I say that this impacts the right to dignity? I say so because corruption on a large scale depletes the state of its resources, and the people who suffer the most are the poorest of the poor. Needless to say, people who live under extreme poverty are in a situation where their dignity is denuded. That, for me, is a very crucial issue. You asked the ambassador as to the role of leadership. I do not want to be impeached because in our code there is something that says that when judges or justices involve themselves in political controversy, they may be impeached. But let me refer, whatever the risk perhaps to me may be, but let me refer to the example of Singapore, in particular its inaugural Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. Within a very relatively short space of time, he was able to turn around Singapore from a developing to a developed country. And one of the major things he fought, and fought vocally, was corruption. And there's even a saying that goes something like, but I think I've forgotten it. He and his leaders were incorruptible because they were incorruptible. So to cut a long story short, I should perhaps just say we want consistent and sustained action from the top, hitting at the top to fight corruption in this country. Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking the Ambassador, Justice Madlanga, and especially Justice Goldstone, our honoree tonight, for joining us and honoring us with their presence. So thank you very much.